Hi everyone, and welcome to the Conceptualization and Operationalization video lecture. In the last lecture, you learned about the importance of deliberate measurement in social science. And in this lecture, I want to talk about the process of designing those deliberate measurements. Now, I want to warn you that this part, in my opinion, is one of the hardest parts of the course. There's a lot of vocabulary in this module, and it's one of the core components of so many research design decisions, so you need to understand it well. With that in mind, be aware that you may need to watch this video a few times and do some of the class activity practices before you feel really solid in your understanding, and that's totally okay. Remember, you can always go back and watch these lecture videos again anytime you want on my YouTube channel. So in the last video, we talked about the relationship between concepts and variables. Concepts are the abstract mental images that you want to measure, and variables are the observable proxies that you create to measure those concepts. There are two steps in the process of creating a variable: conceptualization and operationalization. The thing I love about this graphic is that it summarizes the process so well. You start with your abstract concept, something you have the mental image of, but you don't know how to fully describe it to someone else yet. So what you first do is you conceptualize the concept, meaning you focus on defining that concept. Then you operationalize the concept, meaning you focus on how to measure the concept. That leads you to develop one or more variables, which you can then use to gather the data you need to make conclusions about the concept itself. Okay, so starting with conceptualization. The goal of conceptualization is to come up with what we call a conceptual definition. This is simply a clear and accurate definition of the concept using words and descriptions that can be measured in real life. The process of conceptualization is actually not too difficult. It's simply a big brainstorming event. You want to think about your concept in as many ways as possible to come up with the final definition, your conceptual definition. Your conceptual definition can define the concept by describing what happens when it exists, or you can define the concept by describing what happens when it's absent. At the end of the conceptualization process, you will know what you want to measure. All right, still confused? Probably it's hard to see it in the abstract. So let's work through an example. So with this example, I am asked to evaluate the service at a local fast food restaurant. The manager of the restaurant wants me to determine whether or not her employees give good service to their customers. So think about that term. You know what good service means, right? But does your good service look like my good service? If your parents come with you to the restaurant, would they measure whether the service was good in the same way? With conceptualization, we want to nail down exactly what good service means so that you, me, your parents, your employers, anyone can use that definition and come to the exact same conclusion about whether or not good service was being provided. So first, we need to brainstorm everything that we could observe or measure that would indicate good service exists. Okay, so the first thing that comes to your mind is your food ready fast? But here's the problem. What is fast? This is another common issue that students have, defining a concept with a concept. We want to be as specific as possible so that there's no conclusion. So let's avoid the use of subjective terms like fast, hard, quickly, happily, things like that. So instead of fast, we can use a specific time frame. That's measurable and objective no matter who is measuring it. So how about this? Food is ready within 5 minutes of your order. That's a specific criteria that all of us would measure the same way. Good. But fast service isn't the only thing that could make good service, right? What else could we observe that would indicate good service? What about the customer service part of it? I think that if the cashier greets you before you start your order, that also makes good service. What else? What about your food being hot? I think that's also part of having good service. Notice here, though, that I didn't write food is hot when you pick it up because we all have different definitions of hot. So instead, I pick a specific temperature, 165 degrees Fahrenheit, to indicate that my food was hot when I picked it up. Now, this last one that I want to highlight here will look a little bit different to me. Remember that I said you can brainstorm things to observe that indicate good service is present, but you can also brainstorm ways to observe that good service is not present. So I wanted to include an example of that specifically on here so you can see what I mean by that. This last idea would represent bad service to me, so it's not an example of good service. But if I was measuring good service and I observe this behavior, then I could infer that I'm not observing good service at the fast food restaurant. So if I did not receive all of the items I ordered when I pick up my food, I would say I didn't get good service. So remember that not all of your definitions here have to be positive examples of the concept. Okay, so now we've come up with a lot of different definitions for good service. Now it's time to pick our conceptual definition. Because you're just learning how to conduct research, we're going to do this the easy way, and that is to take one and only one of the definitions you come up with to serve as your conceptual definition to carry forward. In real life, you rarely look at just one aspect of the concept, because as you can tell, observing only one of the things on this slide doesn't mean you had bad service or good service. You would need to make multiple observations about these items and probably other definitions. But again, for learning purposes, we are going to choose one and only one to continue forward as our conceptual definition of good service. The choice of the conceptual definition is completely up to you, but it should be something relevant to the research question and something you are able to observe. For example, I don't carry a thermometer around with me, so I wouldn't be able to check the food's temperature without extra supplies. But my phone has a timer on it, so the 5-minute definition is easy enough for me to measure. So I'm going to use that definition. Food is ready within 5 minutes of my order. That's going to be my conceptual definition of good service. Okay, now that you know what you want to measure, now it's time to figure out how to measure it. This is called operationalization. Operationalization involves you making decisions about how you are going to collect the data and how many measures you need to measure the conceptual definition. One of the biggest questions you need to answer during operationalization is what type of data you're going to use. There are several different kinds of data you can collect, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. The first type of data, and one of the most commonly used in criminal justice, is self-report data. Self-report data means you ask someone about the behaviors they have actually engaged in. So in the case of my good service definition, I would ask people how many times they have gotten their food in 5 minutes or less when visiting the restaurant. In criminal justice, self-report data is often coupled with victimization data. Victimization data involves the same contact with someone, but this time they're reporting the behaviors that have been done to them, not by them. Why I say these are often coupled is that surveys about crime will often ask the person to report what illegal behaviors they have engaged in themselves, which is self-report data, but also what crimes they've been victim of, which is victimization data. Another common source of data is official data. This is data collected by governments, institutions, supervisors, etc., and usually not for research purposes, but for some sort of management or supervision purpose. For instance, when you go to McDonald's, you can see that screen that shows how long an order has been waiting since it was placed. McDonald's is gathering that information for their own business purposes. But if I had access to that for my research, I could use that data to determine how many customers waited more than 5 minutes to receive their food. The advantage of official data is that it's usually much easier to collect once you get permission. I'm sure McDonald's has all of that information stored on a hard drive somewhere. So once I get access to it, I can just download it on my PC and go. Social artifacts are less commonly used in criminal justice research, but they are useful in a lot of the social sciences. Social artifacts means anything that's created by a human. Things like letters, books, movies, podcasts, online blogs, etc. Like official data, social artifacts are not usually created for the purposes of research, but they can give us insight into what was happening. Social artifacts aren't always relevant to the research purpose, though. For example, I can't think of any social artifacts that I could use to measure your wait time at McDonald's, unless maybe you wrote a blog about how slow they were that day. But that's not going to give me a very good measurement, so it's not a data source that I would use. The last one, and one of the most reliable, is observation. Observation means literally that. The researcher sits down somewhere and observes whatever behaviors they were looking for a predetermined amount of time. In my fast food example, I could go to the fast food restaurant and watch customers order and get their food for an hour. During that hour, I would use my phone to time all of them from order to pick up food, and then I would know how many people got their food in under 5 minutes. This is one of the best ways to get research data because you're gathering the exact data that you need. The problem is the time-intensive part of this data source. Instead of downloading a whole year of data from McDonald's or sending out surveys to 1,000 customers, I have to physically watch the ordering counter for a long time to get that same amount of data. This is why observation is typically done on smaller samples. The second question you need to decide during operationalization is whether or not you will need multiple questions or observations to measure the conceptual definition that you picked. Realistically, most concepts in social science will require multiple questions. For example, here's a personality test that uses 5 different characteristics. The concept they are measuring is your personality, which is obviously a very broad concept. Even within the 5 different conceptual definitions they provide, they're also using multiple questions for each part of those 5. So instead of just asking you, are you introverted or extroverted, they ask you a series of questions about how you behave in a group, your social group preferences, your confrontation abilities, etc. And then they use that to make a final conclusion about your introversion or your extroversion. That allows them to use multiple measures to get a better idea of what's happening. These combination measures are called scales or indices. Essentially, they use multiple questions to develop a broader score that will then measure the concept more fully. The way I always remember them is to think about those old quizzes from magazines when you're a kid. Like, are you a summer or fall person? Is your relationship doomed or destined? Those kind of things. All of those magazine quizzes would have 5 to 10 statements that you would like agree or disagree with, or maybe you'd have some, ABC kind of choice. And then they would have some kind of scoring mechanism, right? Answer these 10 questions about your relationship. And if you had 6 or more yeses, then your relationship was destined. Less than 3 yeses and your relationship is doomed. That kind of thing. That's essentially what we're doing, but obviously a little bit on a more refined scale. Okay, so let's go back to my good service research example. Remember that my conceptual definition that I picked was that food was ready within 5 minutes of your order. Now I'm going to go with observation data, meaning that I'm going to sit in the restaurant for a certain amount of time and I'm going to record all of the times that the customers waited more than 5 minutes for their food. The specifics of my observation will be guided by my lit review and previous research, but let's just decide that I'm going to observe 1 hour every weekday for 1 week, so 5 hours of observation. The next thing I need to decide is whether I will need multiple measures or if I can measure my conceptual definition with a single measure. Consider these 2 ideas. On one hand, I can start a timer every time a customer orders and then stop the timer when they pick up their food. Anything over 5 minutes would count against good service. On the other hand, though, this may get confusing because what happens if a customer orders immediately after another? I would need multiple stopwatches and that could get confusing. So option 2 is to record the time when the customer places their order and then record the time when the customer picks up their order. Subtracting the 2 times later will give me the total time waited, which I can then use to determine whether good service was observed or not using my conceptual definition. Of the 2, I think the second is easier. That is going to require multiple measures, the time of order and the time of pickup. So that's going to be my final decision. The important thing I want to point out here is that there is no right or wrong in this process. I could have chosen self-report data and used a single measure. I could have used official data and multiple measures. It's all about researcher preference, available resources, budget restrictions, etc. When a researcher writes a method section in their paper, they're not only telling the reader what they did, they're also justifying to the reader why they did what they did. In this case, I would argue why observation data was better than the others and also why 2 measures was better. The reader can then agree or disagree with me. Oh, there's my option. I'm picking 2 measures. Okay, so we're almost there, everyone. We're now at the bottom of the flowchart at the variable stage. This is just a fancy word for a real-world measure. It's the question, statement, or observation that you're going to make in your research. Variables are just a matter of putting together all of the decisions you made during conceptualization and operationalization into a final form. In terms of my good service example, here are my final 2 variables that I will use to measure good service: food order time and food pickup time. Again, is this the best, most comprehensive definition of good service? Absolutely not. But I want you to focus on only one conceptual definition at a time so that you can learn how to get that really good, specific operationalization that we're looking for in this class. The last thing I want to mention about conceptualization and operationalization is that a hypothesis contains only the abstract concepts, meaning that the researcher has to go through the conceptualization and operationalization stage for both the independent variable and the dependent variable. Now, each process will be done separately, so your conceptual definition for each variable will only describe that concept, not the other concept or the relationship between the two. We're going to have some more practice with this during the module, but trying to conceptualize both of the concepts at the same time is a common issue for students. So I want you to really think about putting your blinder on. When you are looking at the independent variable, completely ignore the dependent variable and go through conceptualization and operationalization. Then turn your attention to the dependent variable and completely ignore the independent variable. Go through that process again. Okay, that finishes up the conceptualization and operationalization discussion for right now. Again, I want to encourage you to review this video a few more times. Try out some examples on your own as you go through the video, because this lecture material can take a while to really process. And the more practice and discussion that you do, the more help it will be. Remember, I'm also always available to meet one-on-one to discuss your questions and concerns as well. Thanks for watching, everyone.